Okay, we're on Mem Beis Amud Beis, toward the bottom of the page. Second to bottom line. Tuma ubia nami hamitma v'koi. Morning, good morning. Okay. 42b, second to last line. Okay, so yesterday we were in the middle of discussing how if somebody is already tamei, so then he can't become, if he's still touching a dead body, he touches another dead body, then he does not get malchus. There's no second time. However, if he leaves go of a dead body and then touches a different dead body, then he would be chayav malchus. This is true both of a Nazir and of a kohen. Now, in the beginning of the Gemara explained that it's possible to have tuma ubia. You can become tamei and walk into tuma. The Gemara wants to know, how does that happen? Tuma ubia nami hadmitma v'koi. In other words, if a guy is holding a dead body and walks into a cemetery, he's already tamei. So why does he get malchus twice? Once for walking in and once for holding a dead body. So Amar Rav Yochanan kan bebayis kan besada. The concept of tuma ubia, meaning walking into tuma, is only possible with regard to oil, where a guy walks into a room with tuma. 1 second. Okay, so in other words, he's holding a dead body and he walks into a house. In that scenario, because it's different types of tumas, he's chayav twice. So the Gemara says, okay, so now exactly how does that happen? In other words, we have to have a scenario where you're in a house holding a dead body. I'm sorry, you're holding a dead body and walking into a house, and we want a scenario where you become tamei through touching and entering at the same time. Okay, so in other words, we're looking for a scenario where he touches and enters the house at the same time. He touches dead bodies. The Gemara says, in the scenario where he walks into a house. So kivan the oil yodei istav ki al kulei hai tomehu. When somebody walks into a house, so we say that the tumah of oil of the house, it's as if it fills the whole house, which means that the moment his finger walks in, he's already touched the dead body. It's as if he touched the dead body because you have oil. So therefore, the moment he moves his hand in, istav, he becomes tamei. Ki al kulei hai ki al kula gufa hai tomehu. So it's as if he already is carrying a dead body when he walked into the house, in which case he's already tamei. So why is he chayav for walking into the house? El Amar Balazar Sir of Yada Mishum Tuma Eka Mishum Bia Leka. The truth is if he enters the house with his hands first, meaning let's say he's walking and his hands are moving back and forth. And because his hands are moving back and forth, when he enters the house, his hands enter the house first. In that case, you're right. The truth is that his hands become tamei first, and therefore it's as if he's holding a dead body walking to the house. It's already tamei. He's already connected to the tumah, and therefore he's not chayav for entering the house. Okay. But 1 second. Sir if Yada, if he's holding his house together, Steve, can I trouble you to bring a glass of hot water? Thank you. So if he 1 second. So if he's walking in with his hands first, which doesn't necessarily mean hands, it means his foot also, which typically is what happens before you walk into something. Usually, some other part of your body enters first before the majority of the torso or the head. Okay. Mishum tuma eka, you have tuma mishum bi'aleka. So if you walk into the house with your hands first or your feet first, so then you have tuma first, and you don't have bia. You didn't walk into tuma because your hands touched the tuma beforehand. Okay. So what's the scenario? Scenario where he lined himself up like a soldier and somebody pushed him in. Okay, what's the problem here? Doesn't make a difference. Why? Because everyone's Jewish here. Everyone has a nose. Oh. And the nose enters first. Yeah. Right? Right, the nose comes first. Gemara says, it would be about the Adadikasis. Gemara says, obviously his nose went in first before his head and his torso. And therefore, again, you have Tumas Maga. He touched the dead body before he actually enters. He didn't really solve the problem. Okay. Okay. El Amar Rava. So Rava says, one second. Yes, it seems the proper text variation here is Hechnes Chaytmei, meaning that in every scenario, basically, of walking in, your nose comes in first, and therefore you have Tuma first and not Bia. You didn't walk into Tuma. Hechnes Gufay, Tuma Bia Bahadik Dodika Asian. If his body goes in, so I guess he's going in backwards here, so then everything comes together. So the Gemara says, it's also the carry beresha. Maybe his toe is coming in first. In other words, the guy is trying to put his head in first. So he puts his head in sideways. But presumably his toe comes in first. Amar Papa, it's also not a solution because you still have a tumah first. Amar Papa, he entered the house inside a box. And then what happens? His friend, his friend went ahead and obviously had to. Thank you very much. His friend entered the house with him and pulled off the roof with him. I'm sorry, the box. So, in other words, so him and his friend together removed the roof, the cover of the box. So now he entered the house and touched it together at the same time. And therefore, Tomobia Bahadi Hadodi Kasian. Okay. Another possibility is Marba Rashi Amar. Higayin the Ayel Kishu Gaisis, Vinafik Nishmasi. There was a okay, what's a Gaisis? A Gaisis is somebody who's, I don't know how to say this in English, he's sort of hovering between life and death. He's really at the end of his life. It's much more than terminal illness or hospice care. This is somebody who's, literally moving in and out. The throes of death. Yeah, he's literally about to die. So very simple. The guy was literally about to die, and then he literally died. And he entered the tumas oil, and the tumah of touching literally happened at the same moment, and therefore he's chayev twice. The Yosef, once he passes away, the tumah will be about the hadadi kaasi, and they come at the same moment. Okay. So therefore, we have a way to fulfill the obligation, the possibility of tumah ubiyah bahadi adadi, where you can have the touching tumah as well as the walking tumah occurring at the same moment. Okay. So that takes care of the first side of the Gemara. We're now on Mem Gimel and Aleph, but halfway down the page.
It's strange that you do twice when it just seems like it's like one.
It's one. Yeah. It's interesting because you'd think that like there'd be a better possibility of it is. It is very interesting because bia here, meaning entering tumah, it's really not possible. In other words, it's never really possible unless you have these extreme situations to enter tumah without sort of being the equivalent of entering a cemetery holding a corpse. In which case, there is no second penalty for entering. So it really is a very limited scenario, and it's a little odd. Okay, 43a, about halfway down, last word on the line is Tanur Rabbanon. Okay, now we go back to, again, so both a Kohen and a Nazir have a prohibition to become Tameh to a dead body. Toner Rabbanon, we learned lehechaloi, to become. 1 second, let me just get the whole verse here. Okay. The pasuk says that a kohen cannot become tamei lehechaloi, to make himself profane, to remove his sanctification. What does that mean? Obviously, it's an extra word because it says the pasuk reads lo yatame ba'al ba'am of lehechaloi. A kohen should not become tamei lehechaloi, to remove his sanctification. Well, what does that mean? In other words, what does it mean to remove his sanctification? First of all, it's extra. Regardless of whether or not the reason for the kohen becoming tamei removes some of its sanctification or not, it's still prohibited. And therefore, what's the extra word coming to tell me? So the first opinion says ad shah sheyamos, until the moment the guy actually dies, meaning the kohen has someone who he's dealing with who's in the throes of death. He's allowed to deal with him, even though he may imminently die. Rabbi says, La yitama lahem b'maisam. 1 second. This is by Nazir. By Nazir, the Torah says a person cannot become tamei la'aviv la'imay la'achav la'achaisei, his father or mother, brother or sister. La yitama lahem b'maisam. He should not become tamei in their death. What does that mean? Obviously, it means b'maisam 1 second. Change here. Until they actually die, meaning that again, while they're in the throes of death, presumably you cannot, you could deal, you can be metapel with them, you can deal with them and help them whatever they need, or be in the house for that matter. Okay, that's the first opinion. My benai, what's the difference between these two explanations? In other words, one's learning from Nazir, one's learning from Kayin. So Amar B'Yechanan Mashmois Dorshim Ikeveinayo. According to B'Yechanan, there is no difference. It's effectively the same derivation, and both of them say that you could be in the house when somebody is imminently about to die, but you cannot be in the house once they die. And some say it's learned from Nazir, and some say it's learned from Kayin. Rish Lakish Amar, Rish Lakish says, Goises Ikeveinayo. The difference is a geisis. A geisis again is somebody who's in the throes of death. According to Rish Lakish, Lamanda Amar Melehechaloi Afilu geisis. The one that says to make his sanctification profane, it means even if there's no tumah yet, even once somebody's in the throes of death, the kohen is not allowed to be in the house, except that the kohen is allowed to become tamei to the 7 relatives, right? Father, 2 up, 2 down, right, left, and his wife. Okay. According to the opinion that says we learn it out of Nazir, because the Torah says they have to be dead. Achiyamos and it geisis loy. You're only allowed to become tamei to somebody who is. It's a bit of a misnomer. You can't become tamei to a geisis. A geisis does not have tumah. We'll see the Gemara will ask in a second. There is no tumah to a geisis. The geisis is someone who's in the throes of death. Tumah is only when somebody actually dies. Somebody's still alive, there's no tumah. And therefore, if we're saying the kohen can't become tamei to a geisis, it doesn't really mean he can't become tamei to a geisis. It means that the extent of the Torah's stringency in preventing the kohen from becoming tamei extends to even the moment when the said person is a geisis, even though he's not yet tamei. And we'll explain that all in a few moments. Okay. But according to the opinion says the person has to actually be dead as long as he's a geisis. The Nazir is allowed to be in the house. By the way, probably not a recommended thing to do, obviously, right? To be in the house of somebody who's in the throes of death.
It does happen.
Yeah, it certainly can happen. My father was young. They had one of his rebbeim fell very ill, and the whole yeshiva, you take turns, staying in his room, and if he needed something, and calling the nurse, whatever it was. It was my father's turn. He actually died. Yeah, it was a little traumatic for my father. Then he wasn't that old. Anyway, okay. as an aside, once we're talking about being present when somebody dies, those in the Chaver Kedusha probably know that it's considered a tremendous merit to be next to somebody while they die, and it's the Svarim say, great rabbis say that it happens very often where somebody is attending someone who's about to die, and he goes out to the bathroom for a moment, and that's when they die, or they leave the room for a moment. Because once they leave the being present during death means being present in the room, and once they leave, that's very often he's not worthy of seeing somebody die, and therefore he ends up being out of the room when it happens.
Wife was there when her mother passed.
Yeah, it's interesting.
My dad sent me to visit someone in the hospital in his stead once, and I had no clue who she was. And I got there, and they were like, "It's about to be over." I don't know who she is. Like, do you know who it is? I don't know, but I stayed, and then
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, okay. So now, obviously, the question is: but obviously, b'moisam is extra because if you're being tummy to somebody, obviously they're dead. But obviously, lehechala is extra because presumably kayin is prohibited whether or not it makes him profane or not. So, what does lehechala come to tell me? So, obviously, there's an extra word by nazir. There's an extra word by kayin. So, if whichever one you learn from, what do you do with the other one? The Gemara says. So if you learn it out of Kayin, what do you do with the pasuk of B'maisim by Nazir? It's necessary for the teaching of Rabbi Tanya. We learned Rabbi Aimer B'maisim Einim Mitame Aval Mitama B'nig Asam Ubezivasam. Okay, so then the extra word of Nazir is coming to tell me that specifically Tumas Mace is prohibited for Nazir. Only Tumas Mace. If somebody has Tumah Yotzim and Aguf, which is Zov Anidi Yelades, or they're a mitzvah, they become a mitzvah. In those cases, you're allowed to become tummy to them. The mitzvah is only prohibited, and the kayin as well, from tumas meis, from a dead body, not from other tumas. Okay. Well, Lamanda Omer b'maisam, according to the opinion that says you learn it out of Nazir, in fact, hami b'alei l'hai svara. So then, what do you do with the fact that you need to tell me that you're allowed to become tummy to a mitzvah? In other words, the Torah says b'maisam by Nazir, isn't that coming to tummy mitzvah? That you're allowed to become tummy to somebody who's a mitzvah. Only to a dead person you can't become tummy. So how does he learn both things? Number one, that the guy needs to be completely dead, and number two, that only when he's dead and not when he's a mitzvah. How does he learn both things? So Gemara says, it should say when he dies, my b'maisam. What's the plural? Shema mina tarti tells me both things. Number one, that the Nazir is prohibited only when the guy is completely dead, not when he's in the throes of death. And second of all, specifically death, not mitzvah. Okay, now the opposite. According to the opinion that says when he dies, what about the fact that he learns that of Nazir? What does he do with the pasuk of Kayin, where it says lehechalai? Gemara says lehechalai lahachi yuda asa. Lehechalai is coming to tell me something else. The misha einim mechol yatzazeh shemechol va'omet. 1 second. Okay, in other words, Lechai comes to tell me that he becomes tummy by this tumah. But if the guy's already holding on to the corpse, like we saw yesterday, and then he becomes tummy again while he's holding on to a corpse, then he's not chayiv. One second. Yeah, okay. So Mara says, so if you do learn from Kayin, what do you do with the fact that you need the same verse to tell me that you can't become tummy twice if you're holding on to a dead person? So Gemara says, why is it plural? Same thing, it tells me both things. It tells me, number one, that a Kayin should not be in a house of a person who's in the throes of death. And number two, that if he's already tamei and he's holding on to a dead body and then he touches another dead body, he's not chayev. Meisvei, the Gemara asks, Adam ena mitame el ad shetetzei nafshay. Person does not become tamei until he dies. Va'afilu meguyed va'afilu geisis. Meguyed is sort of somebody who's been cut into pieces, hasn't yet let go of his last breath. Another possibility is meguyed could be somebody who's been hung from the gallows, sort of he hasn't yet died. Va'afilu geisis, or va'afilu geisis, somebody who's in the throes of death. So you see here that tumo. You see that a person is not tamei until he actually dies. If that's the case, then why is a kohen prohibited to become tamei? He's not dead yet. And tumah only happens when he's dead. So Gemara says that there is no tumah. So Gemara says you're right. The truth is that a person is not tamei until he's dead completely. He's taken his last breath. He's completely dead. But with regard to the fact that the death process has begun, it's already begun, and that's what the Torah is warning a kohen not to do. Even though the truth is he isn't actually tamei. Okay.
Well, basically, it's a mechitza.
What was that?
I said basically it's putting up a mechitza.
You mean separate himself from? Yeah.
What if someone's being resuscitated?
That's a question. That's a very good question. So I think it would depend on. Well, this is a complicated discussion. How to define death? That's you can't resuscitate somebody who doesn't have spontaneous brain activity. Right? There's nothing to resuscitate. So now I guess that would be one of the questions: is how do you measure that? There are ways of measuring that. Yeah, but spontaneous brain activity could still be somebody whose brain that still has spontaneous brain activity. So otherwise, he wouldn't be able to cycle his heart. But that means the other part that thinks could be dead, but he could still have the activity enough to be able to keep his heart going. So it's a complicated discussion. Okay. Omer of Chizda is a little bit more morbid. Omer Rav, in the name of Rav, Nikta Roisha Shel Aviv Ein Mitamali. If somebody's we're talking about a kohen here, a kohen who wants to become tamei's father. If his father was part of the language guillotined, and his head is rolled off, then you cannot become tamei to him, because you can only become tamei to your father when he's a whole body. And this is sort of the discussion of the Gemara. The Gemara will go back and forth in this. It's apparently a machlaikas. What Shachar says, what time? 6:45 today?
6:45. 45.
45.
45.
Yeah.
Okay. 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 I must have right. Okay. I thought Daf Yomi. What time was Daf Yomi then? 55, right?
Should be 55, yeah.
Okay. Daf Yomi was 50. Okay. We'll wait a few more minutes. Okay. Okay. If his father's head is cut off, then he does not become tamei to him. My time. What's the reasoning? Amakra la'aviv. That a kohen. By the way, a Nazir does not become tamei to his relatives, not his father, not his mother, not his son, not his son's daughter, his brothers or sisters. Period.
When you say it does not become, you mean
he's not allowed to
become.
He's not allowed to. However, a kohen is allowed to. Kohen is allowed to 7 relatives. Okay, so kohen is allowed to become tamei to his father. If his father is not whole, the body isn't complete. So he does not become tamei. My time. He becomes tamei to his father when his father is a complete deceased body, but not if there's something that's missing. And the Gemara will go back and forth. We'll discuss this in more detail. Rav Hamnuna says, if a guy was traveling in the Valley of Highwaymen, is quite literally how it translates. Upasku gan v'lereshi, and robbers, executed him, and they cut off his head. Is it the case that he shouldn't become tamei to his father, and he shouldn't bury his father? Amar lei, so he says to him, hold on a second, we have a different rule, which is that a kohen becomes tamei to a meis mitzvah. If there's somebody who doesn't have anyone to bury him, then the kohen is allowed to bury him. So Amarlei says Meis Mitzvah Kamrik. You're talking about somebody, obviously, if they're in the Valley of Highwaymen, presumably there aren't too many people that are available to bury him. I don't know if the Chaver Kadisha wants to go in, it's too dangerous. So therefore, obviously, he should bury him. If you have a regular person, in other words, if a Kayan sees somebody at the side of the road, they have an obligation to become Tamei and bury them, even if he's not his father. So certainly, if it is his father, certainly he should go ahead and become Tamei and bury him. Okay, so the Gemara says, so the Gemara asks, "V'hameis mitzvahu, is this person a meis mitzvah?" Okay. Now, the question obviously is how to define a meis mitzvah. What does a meis mitzvah mean? A meis obviously is a dead person. Mitzvah means a mitzvah, positive commandment. So meis mitzvah, you have a positive commandment to go ahead and bury him. Who is a meis mitzvah? What makes somebody into a meis mitzvah? So the Gemara says what makes somebody into a meis mitzvah is if he has relatives that are available to bury him. Now, presumably, the Gemara says this: the Kayan's father has other relatives that could bury him, and therefore, he shouldn't be a meis mitzvah. But Tanya, we learned ezehu meis mitzvah kol she'ein lo kofrim. A meis mitzvah is somebody. We're in 43b, about a third of the way down. First word in line is meis mitzvah. But Tanya, ezehu meis mitzvah. What is a meis mitzvah? Kol she'ein lo kofrim. Kairei ve'acherim ayimrim. What does it mean? It means that there's no one to bury him. What does that mean? That means you say, Beryl Schmerl died, and nobody knows who Beryl is. There's nobody who will answer the call of Beryl. That's someone who's a meis mitzvah. Now the Gemara presumes that this guy, if we announce that this Kayan's father, right? This Kayan's father dies, presumably a bunch of people would say, I'm here to bury him. So therefore, the guy does have people to help out burying him. Maybe it's a son-in-law who's not a Kayan who can help out, and therefore the Kayan doesn't need to become Tamei, because remember, his father here was executed. His head was cut off, decapitated. What?
Is the only son of an only son of an only
Well,
son.
the Gemara is better, an easier answer. So the Gemara says it's not a, if somebody dies in the hospital, and then they have the they put out the next of kin, and there is no next of kin. Okay, so that's clearly a meis mitzvah, right? Okay, fine. Now, if there is a next of kin, so presumably he's not a meis mitzvah, because presumably the next of kin is not in prison and is not on a long business trip, etc. So he'll take care of burying the body. However, when the guy's on a business trip, the guy's in the Valley of Highwaymen, you can call whoever you want, nobody's coming. So even if he does have a bunch of relatives, it doesn't make a difference. It's not like somebody who dies in a hospital, we're going to notify the next of kin to bury. If the guy dies in the Valley of Highwaymen, nobody's coming to bury him. And therefore, in effect, at that moment, even though he does have next of kin that are available to bury, to help bury him, but not in the Valley of Highwaymen. And therefore, at that moment, the guy's father is indeed a meis mitzvah. 1 second. But Islay bro, he has children. The Gemara says no. Keeping the cause of borcha, kamish and like from Davi. Since he's in this dangerous place, it's as if he has nobody to bury him. Okay. Now the Gemara is going to try to address the original source. What is the story with burying somebody who is missing organs? And obviously, what's the answer? It's machlokes. So let's go through the Gemara now. Meisvei. Meisvei, first word on the line, about halfway down the page. Lo yitama, lohu matama, ve'ena matama le'eva reho. Lefish ena matama le'eva min achai. A person becomes tamei to his sister, but not to her organs. Lefish ena matama le'eva min achai shalaviv. Just like a person doesn't become tamei, let's say his father, there is tumah to Aver min hachai, meaning if you have a person who's alive and he loses an organ, a limb in a firework accident or whatever, that organ is tamei, and if it cannot be put back together, then it is buried. A kain does not become tamei to an aver min achai, meaning the person's still alive, but his organ is dismembered, and it's can't be attached together. 1 second. Because just in other words, he doesn't become tamei to his sister's organs, his sister's limbs, just like he doesn't become tamei to his father's limbs. But he will go back to bury an etzem kisaira, a bone that's larger than a grain of barley. So the minimum quantity for tumah of a bone is a grain of barley. Once the bone is larger than a grain of barley, then there's tumah to it. So what does that mean? He goes back to bury a grain of barley. My matzur letzem kasara. What does that mean? Lava memra, doesn't it mean the imechser porta loy? 1 second. 1 second. Sorry. Okay. So it means as follows. Let's say he buried his father, and then he finds out that somewhere else is an etzem kusaira. There's a small amount of bone somewhere else. Let's say, God forbid, his father passed away in some sort of freak accident where some of his limbs went all over the place, and so he buries his father, and then he buries some other part of the limb that he found elsewhere. Okay. So lavla member the imechser porta. And evidently you see that you can bury your father. The Kayin is allowed to bury his father or his sister, even if they're not complete. Their bodies aren't complete. Because obviously here he buried his father first, and then he went ahead and found some missing bone. So the Gemara says, no, light, not necessarily. Hahi Rabbi Yehudah. This could be the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. The Tanya Rabbi Yehudah Aimer. Rabbi Yehudah says, lo yitama. He becomes tamei to his sister. The ena metame le'evarim, he does not become tamei to her limbs. She'ena metame le'evar min achai shalaviv. Aval mitmahu le'evar min hameis shalaviv. Rabbi Yehudah says you don't become tamei to the limb of a live person, meaning if a kain's relative loses a limb, he does not become tamei to that limb, but he does become tamei to if the relative who passed away in a manner such that the body isn't whole. So in that case, he could become tamei to the body that isn't whole. And okay, so in other words, there's a debate whether or not you can become tamei to a body that isn't whole. So the Gemara says, "V'hatanya," we learned Rav Kahana, Rav Elazar ben Yaakov. 1 second. Oh, let's see here. Rav Kahana ben Rav Elazar ben Yaakov. So Rav Kahana, the son of Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, said as follows: Lo yitama, he becomes tamei to his sister. Ve'ein metame le'evarim, he does not become tamei to her organs, to her limbs. What does this mean? Prat lekazayis min hameis ukazayis not. So this excludes a bunch of categories. What does that mean? He does not become tamei to a kazayis min hameis, meaning a kazayis is a measurement of the olive of meat, of flesh of the deceased, or kazayas notzel. Kazayas notzel is sort of pardon for those who need breakfast. It's a measurement of sort of liquid, of bodily fluids that exudes from the deceased body. Umole tarvid rokav, or measurement of sort of rotten flesh, if the flesh has already begun to disintegrate.
Decomposed flesh and fluids that ooze from the corpse.
Yeah, okay. So these things you can't become tamei to. I would think that you wouldn't become tamei l'shedra, to the spine, l'gogolos is the skull, or alternatively l'roiv, in other words, either the spine or the skull, or l'roiv binyana, to the most of the mass of the body, majority of the mass, or l'roiv minyana. You don't have the majority of the mass of the body, but you do have 100. So I guess traditionally the human body is considered to have 248 organs. How those break down is a separate discussion. If you have 125 of them, which is the majority, right? 124 is half.
Mhm.
125 organs would be the majority, even if they're the smaller majority, meaning they're lighter, they're not 51% of mass, then you'd still become tummy to all of these. So ksiv, the pasuk says, Kishu Kosav, when the Torah says, V'amarta alayim, Haisef l'cha kosav tuma acheres. The Torah includes these in the category. 1 second. That in all these things you become that he could become tummy to his sister. I would think like Tam l'shedul goes to Rabbi Yana shalacherim. I would think that because the Torah specifically indicates to us that you become tummy, but in other words, all of this is true by his sister because it says lo yitam. You become tummy to her, meaning you become tummy to her, not to sort of measurement of bodily fluids or rot or flesh, but yes to majority skull, the skull, the spine, the majority of the limbs of the organs, and the majority of the mass. This is all true by a sister. What about the other relatives? There are 7 relatives that kind of becomes tummy. A sister is just one of them. So I would think everybody else is different. Amrit, I would argue as follows: just like a sister is one of the people that he becomes tummy to, and you become tummy to all these categories, to the l'shedra, the spine, the gogelos, the skull, the rei binyana, majority mass, the rei binyana, the majority of limbs. Av kol shegufa toli by, you also become tummy to any other relative. In other words, to any other relative that you become tummy to, the same categories you also become tummy to. Okay, this clearly indicates that you also become tummy to a partial body. 1 second. Okay, so this is another support that a person. Again, the Gemara started off trying to prove that you become tamei to a. Sorry, the Gemara started off with Rav Chiz's opinion that you cannot become tamei to a partial body. And so far we brought one brisa. We said that was Rav Yehudah, which said you could become tamei to a partial body. We said that an etzem kisayra was missing, and now we're bringing a second brisa, the brisa from Rav Kahana that quoted Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. And Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov said that you become tamei to all sorts of half a body, or body that's clearly missing parts. So this is clearly difficult on the opinion of Rav Chizda in the name of Rav. Rav Chizda said, that's we started the Gemara, that says that you only become tamei to a full corpse, a complete corpse. So what's the Gemara's response to the second brisa? Obviously, it's also Rav Yehudah. Hahinami Rav Yehudah. This is also the opinion of Rav Yehudah. So who does Rav hold like? At this point, it's not just Rav Yehudah, right? It's Rav Yehudah and 2 brises, one of which is Rav Elazar ben Yaakov as well. So Gemara says Rav goes with the following opinion. Rav da'amar ki hai Tana. Rav goes with this Tana. The Tanya we learned. Ma'aseh shemeis aviv shel Rabbi Yitzchak beginzik. There's a story where the father of Rabbi Yitzchak in the town of Ginzik passed away. Ubo v'hadiu la'achar shalosh shanim. I guess Rav Yitzchak presumably lived far away, and he didn't know his father passed away until 3 years later. Now, obviously, within the span of 3 years, there's been a lot of disintegration of the body. And the question was, I guess, if he could become tamei to bury him. They asked Rabbi ben Elisha what the story is. The Dal Zakanim Shima and the 4, senior rabbis that were with him. They said, "L'Aviv bismanshu shalom v'lei bismanshu chaser." It said the person becomes tamei, a kayin becomes tamei. Presumably, Rabbi Yitzchak was a kayin. He becomes tamei to his father only when the corpse is complete, and not when the corpse is not complete. Okay, stop here. Let's just review the Gemara briefly. We started off discussing how it's possible to become tamei through entering tumah, even though you didn't touch the tumah. So the Gemara has a few explanations. The Gemara is always stumbling on the following situation, which is that the way you enter tumah is through tumas oil. Tumas oil is what we say command mal yadami. as if it's filled up with tumah. As if tumah is you can imagine tumah being a physical substance. You imagine the house being filled with that substance. The problem is that in order to become tumas oil, the head or the torso have to enter the house. And the only way for that to happen is by something else coming to the house first. So effectively, you've touched the substance of tumah before you enter it. So the Gemara's three explanations basically don't resolve the matter, because you always have this problem. You always are touching a dead body as if you're touching a dead body before you actually enter. So the Gemara resolves that we're talking about where he's in a box and he opens the box, or alternatively, where he was in a house with somebody who was a geises, he was on the throes of death, and the guy passed away. In which case he entered and touched the dead body at the same time, and he gets malchus twice. Okay, then we had a discussion machlokes whether or not a kohen could become tamei to somebody who's in the throes. Sorry, a kohen does not become tamei to someone who's in the throes of death. Is a kohen allowed to be in a house with somebody who's in the throes of death? And obviously, the Gemara concludes that although the person is not tamei, but kohen is still prohibited in being in the house, according to one opinion. And the Gemara says from these psukim, we also learn that a kohen who's already touching a dead body cannot become tamei again by touching another dead body while he's holding on to the first, and also that a nazir only is prohibited in becoming tamei to a dead person and not to any other type of tumah, right? Zav and Idi Ledis or etc. Okay, and then what we just saw now was the debate whether or not somebody whose body kohen can become tamei to a relative whose body is incomplete. So machlokes, two brises that seem to say that you could, which run counter to the Gemara, which says you can't become tamei. The Gemara says it's machlokes amongst the Tanam. One opinion says he could, one opinion says he can't. Okay.
Okay.
Enjoy your Purim. Everyone's invited to come over.